Okay, good morning. My name is Gary Matsuoka, and we're here at Laguna Hills Nursery in Santa Ana. It's Saturday morning, and today's class is our number one topic we like to get, especially to our new customers that haven't heard this before. But the main thing we talk about always is the soil that's being used or being recommended by our peers or academia in our field of horticulture. So the problem we're having is that most companies sell you compost to use as soil. So this is a typical company, and everybody's pretty much the same, so it doesn't really matter who you look at. But the material that they're selling you as soil to grow plants in doesn't resemble real dirt at all. This is all mostly chopped up trees. I mean, this would be a great place to grow mushrooms. In our opinion, you want to grow mushrooms, you chop up a tree, and that's going to grow good mushrooms. Real dirt, this is a dirt off of a local farm. And the farmer who runs the place tells me this is the best soil he's farmed on. So a farmer would really like this. They don't look at all alike. There's just no way that this can equal this. And one of the advantages I have is that when I was a kid, my dad planted his plants in containers. I played in this when I was a kid. His pile of dirt, my brothers and I played in it. I recognize the feel. This is considered sandy loam. This we didn't see until, say, the 1980s, when suddenly the industry told us, you can't grow plants in this. There's no nutritional value. You've got to grow in this, which is all nutrition. It's like telling you, you make your house out of your food. Well, actually, plants don't eat this. So this is consumed by fungus and bacteria, and then the plants get the nutritional from that. But this is not plant food either. This is food for fungus and bacteria. So if you want to grow fungus and bacteria, this is the best stuff to grow it in. If you want to grow a healthy plant, healthy plant roots, that's what you do. So first thing I'll list is, what do plants need from their soil? So what do roots require? What do they want from the soil? Number one is quite intuitive. They need moisture storage. They need a source of water. So that's pretty intuitive. Everybody knows that. You got to keep the ground moist to grow a plant. Two is air exchange. So roots of plants are not like the leaves. So the green parts of a plant create oxygen. The rest of the plant consumes oxygen. So you're talking the trunk, the roots, they're just like us. They breathe, they need to have oxygen around them to survive and grow. The problem with a plant compared to an animal like us is we can breathe through our mouth and the oxygen gets to all our fingers and toes because we have a interior circulation system that takes the oxygen there. Plants don't have that. So the oxygen goes out of the foliage into the atmosphere, goes through the soil, and keeps the roots alive. Low oxygen levels cause root rot, and no oxygen causes death. Just like for us, if we're running out of oxygen, we can die, and the roots can too, but low oxygen is certainly the biggest promoter of root rot we know of. So air exchange. Now, there's a lot of problems with journalists in this field that use the wrong terminology. So if a soil can hold moisture, It means it's real porous. If a soil, and we hear so many journalists writing, or you can listen to them or watch the writing, they say use clay pots because they're real porous, the air can go through. That's not why that's not, it means that clay absorbs water. It doesn't mean that it, clay happens to be more porous than more permeable. So airflow, air exchange is permeability. So you want soil to be porous so it holds the water, and you want it to be permeable so the air can get in. So that's two most important things. Number 3, insulation. So the roots of most plants don't like to go below 50, 45 degrees, nor do they like to go above 90. Whereas the foliage on a plant, we haven't gotten close to freezing this last winter, but we can get into the 20s and we can get into the 100 teens and the tops don't die. But the roots certainly can. Roots can die if they go below freezing. And the roots can cook if they go above 100 degrees. So the soil is insulation. Those are the 3 most important. 4 would be stability. It holds the plant upright. But for most plants, nutrition is not part of the deal. Plants do not get nutrition from the soil, but everybody thinks they do. We don't get it. University of California, Davis did a study of the native plants of the Central Valley, and the plants they were studying, which were trees, bushes, some vines, some perennials, they said apparently the plants aren't using the soil for nutrition. They survive and thrive wherever dead leaves pile up. So nature recycles dead leaves. For the vast majority of plants, they've got to recycle the nutrients from dead leaves. It's not them directly. Plants can't eat dead plants. It's fungus and bacteria that break down the dead leaves and give it back to the plants. Now, as far as need of oxygen in the ground, so plant roots need oxygen. There's a wide range of tolerance to low oxygen levels. So on the table here, I brought in plants that typically on this side need more oxygen in the ground to survive. The plants on this side can get by with less. The champion seems to be tomatoes. If you've ever had a compost pile, a pile of dead leaves, the only plant we've ever seen grow in that, tomatoes. They can grow in pure compost, nothing else. You put any other plant in that compost pile and it rots away real fast, because that's what the compost is trying. All the organisms in the compost, fungus, bacteria, earthworms, pill bugs, they're trying to eat that stuff and turn it into something else. The one thing unique about tomatoes is tomatoes have been bred to live among the dead. They actually bred them for their resistance to fungus diseases and bacterial diseases in their root systems. So these guys can handle compost piles. Again, it's the only plant we know of. It's the only plant you ever see growing out of a compost pile. And what we learned is that most of the soil companies who make potting soils, there's probably 100 brands of potting soil, probably more than that, hundreds of brands of potting soils in the United States. The plant they use as a test plant, tomatoes. It's about the only thing that'll grow in their soil is tomato, that'll grow well, is tomatoes. That's what we hear from, that's what we see. That's what I've been told by a soil company in Irvine. They said, we test our soil quality by growing tomatoes in it. If they grow, we know it's good. So they're using if they really wanted to make a good test, use lavender. or a fern or some of the California natives, they're really sensitive to lack of oxygen because they grow in real dirt. I mean, what happens is if the plant's in the trade for generations after generations, and you're growing them in compost, they start choosing the varieties that can handle compost better. So if the plant's been in the trade a long time, usually it's more tolerant of low oxygen levels. Like Goodwin Creek lavender is the most tolerant of low oxygen levels among the lavenders. English lavender is real sensitive. That's the most sensitive plant we've ever seen. But a lot of these plants on this side of the table, if they're growing in compost, they can die within a few years. I mean, silver sheen pittosporum, no contractor, landscape contractor wants to install that because they expect that within 2 or 3 months, that plant's going to be dead. Here's another California native that tends, the book says 1 out of 2 of these, plant 2 if you want one to survive. It's because they've got compost around them. So typically you look at plants in the trade, and they also use, this is pieces of wood or bark. I don't know if there's much else in here but that. Now, so avocado, among fruit trees, avocados are certainly among the most sensitive we've seen. I mean, there's some other ones, lychees from Asia, very sensitive to compost. Then also in the trade, we know flax plants, kangaroo paws, certainly can just rot and fall over. Among the really tolerant plants that you see in landscapes that rarely die, impatiens, they can live in compost. Daylilies, a lot of lilies can handle really bad dirt. The book mentions in particular bird of paradise. They can live in really bad soil. Conifers, so cypresses, junipers, pines, and then palms also can handle low oxygen levels. Daisies, the daisy family seems to be interesting. Pomegranates, we don't see problems with them. Figs, we don't see problems with them. The myrtle family, which includes eucalyptus, some of the leptospermums, they seem to be able to handle compost quite well. Hydrangeas, don't seem to have trouble with hydrangeas. On the opposite end, azaleas have trouble. Camellias have trouble, but hydrangeas not so much. And because succulents don't need a lot of moisture, they can get by with very few roots, the succulent family. So cactus, agaves, aloes, they don't need many roots to survive, so they can be grown in compost, although all these plants certainly look better if they're not. They look a lot better if they're not. So all this stuff, it took us a while to figure out. The nursery industry back in the 50s and early 60s was growing things in this. Yes?
I was wondering about nutrition, moisture, air exchange. Are there any things other than that in the soil? I mean, like iron and nutrients?
Well, the minerals are there in small quantities, but not usually enough for a larger plant. So trees and shrubs, they can't suddenly appear on a vacant lot. So the way this works is if you have a vacant lot, there are plants that are native, that evolved in that area, that can mine the soil sufficiently to get going, and those are called weeds. So most of the weeds, like here we have mustard, we've got foxtail grasses, they can mine the native soil and pick out the nutrients that they need. Once they live there for a number of years, there's enough dead plant material on top of the ground for the bigger plants to come in and steal it from them.
And my sister-in-law she was a botanist at Cornell. She really objected to the use of the word weed. Just
The native plants. Well, actually, a lot of the plants we that come up around here aren't native. I guess mustard's from Europe.
Yeah.
It was brought over, but
Oh, gee, thank you.
so the way nature works, for most plants, once there's a pile of dead leaves on top of the ground, and the average throughout the world, they said, where plants live is 5 inches deep. So 5 inches of dead leaves. You go underneath any big tree in the fall, there's, like this deep of dead leaves if no one blows them away. That's the problem we have, is that everybody's blowing away fertilizer or nutrients. So 5 inches of dead leaves. There's a fungus that's a plant partner to the roots. So So what they found out back about 50 years ago with electron microscopes, so they couldn't tell before that most of what they thought were the roots of woody plants like trees, shrubs, vines were not its roots at all. They were a fungus that's attached to the roots of the plants that goes up into the dead leaves. So this fungus breaks down the dead leaves, and all the minerals are returned to the plant. So what the plant does in exchange for the minerals is that the plant makes sugar in its leaves. So photosynthesis, you're taking carbon dioxide and water, carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground, energy from the sun, you're changing into sugar, which is C6H12O6, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, the same thing that's in water and carbon dioxide. And it creates that. And the plant body, most of the walls of a plant and all the walls of fungus is cellulose, which is a rearranged sugar molecule. So wood itself, didn't bring a piece of wood here. The wood of stems, the trees and all that, they're rearranged sugar molecules. So plants are made out of sugar, which is made out of carbon. So if you got a good forest going, old trees, you got a lot of carbon dioxide stored in that forest, in the trees. It's not in the dirt. They keep thinking it's in the dirt. It's in the trees. It's in the wood. It's in their roots. That's basically where it is. You get a lot of trees growing, and you got a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into the trees. So that's how nature works for the majority of the plants we sell. I mean, there's a few plants, the cabbage family, Brassicaceae, they would rather mine the soil without any of this mycorrhizal fungus around. The mycorrhizal fungus truffles is the mycorrhizal fungus that works with oak trees in France. Most of the mushrooms you see come out of the dirt are mycorrhizal fungus. Now, if it comes out of the trunk of a tree, it's not a mycorrhizal fungus. It's a deadly fungus. But if it comes out of the dirt, a lot of that stuff coming out of the dirt that you see is they're beneficial. They're not bad for plants. Most plants can't survive without this, unless it's a weed. So once the weeds make a lot of this leaf matter, dead leaf matter on the surface, the fungus locks up the nutrients and won't give it back to the weeds. So in a big forest, you'll see trees, you'll see shrubs, some perennials, but you won't see many of the plants we consider weeds because they don't have access to those nutrients anymore. They're all locked up in this system. Leaves fall on the ground, nutrients go right back into the plant. They said this leaf on the ground can go back, the nutrients from that go back into the same tree in as little as 90 days.
So then, I have a tree where I've left the leaves all winter. I have a tree where I've left the leaves all winter. So I was going to take those and harvest them and put them under my tomato plants, but essentially lost their nutrition already?
No,
I think.
no, they're nutritious until they're gone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So you can give them to another plant, but then you got if you keep moving that stuff around, then you got to replace what you've taken away.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Normally we rake it up and throw it away.
right.
Lately, I just like last few years, it's like just leave it. It looks good.
And the plants do not want you to take it away. That's the thing. They're the newest generation of farmers being told all this. You can't throw this stuff away. I mean, we're next to an organic farm for 4 years, and every time they finish a crop, they had this 40-foot trash bin being brought in, and they would just fill it to the top with that crop off of a couple acres of land, and they take it to the landfill. Then they would have to refertilize the entire thing. I mean, that's such a waste. They've got to figure out how to keep that on the, well, I mean, it's when they take it to the landfill, then they make it recycled and then sell it back to the farmers, So they're trying to tell the farmers, you got to figure out how to do this yourself on your own property so you're not wasting all that money. And, just keep it on the land. And in smaller operations, they've already figured a lot of that stuff out. It's just on the big operations, how do you do that and make a living off of that? A farm in Japan started doing stuff like that in the 1960s. They said, it's too much work to take this stuff away, just leave it right there. But it's a small farm. And they do a lot of stuff by hand, but they just leave the material on the ground. So you got to figure out how to do that and be able to live with it, because it's it might look really bad to have all these corn plants just laying on the ground, and after your tomatoes are done, have your tomatoes laying on the ground. So, but anyway, this is how nature works. So this is ideal soil. Now the reason we got into a problem is that this is very heavy. So when I was a kid, they had 1 gallon containers. They had 5 gallon containers. There was no 15-gallon containers, because a 15-gallon bucket, which is 15 inches wide and 18 inches tall, you fill that with this, it'd be about 150 pounds. They had 24-inch boxes, but they had dollies, specially made hydraulic dollies we had to move those things, because a 24-inch box filled of dirt, like 500, 600 pounds of soil. So they were heavy. So the industry wanted to figure out how to make this stuff lighter. So the first thing they were told is get sand and peat moss and mix them together. But peat moss is expensive. It's imported from Canada. It is one of the safer things organically and also light that you can use, because it's been sitting at the bottom of the lake for decades. So it doesn't break down very fast. Like if you have fir bark, so this is freshly ground up fir bark, and you let it if you can't use it right away, because if you make a pile of this, it can catch on fire. It's decomposing so fast once you freshly kill it. You got to wait for that process to cool down a bit, and then it cools off for a while, but it's still decomposing until it's gone. And this thing can decompose totally within a year. Be totally gone within a year. Whereas peat moss, very slow reaction, because it's been sitting in the lakes for so long. It'll last 5 years. That's what we're told. So it's very slow. One of the main things you'll notice, if you put this in a bucket of water, the bucket of water doesn't stink within a month. It still smells like fresh water. Whereas there's different grades of peat. So if the peat has been taken off the surface of the lake, it's real fresh, then it may cause some trouble. But you put bark in a bucket of water, and within a few weeks, it smells like a sewer. It decomposes too quickly. And when you decompose in water that's not been aerated well, it starts making anaerobic, well, there's anaerobic decomposition going on, which creates sewer gases, which are toxic to plants. Plus, it lowers the oxygen of the water. So the thing to know is that overwatering is not a real thing. So when they tell you you're watering too much, I mean, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we never heard that term. There was no such thing as you can water a plant as much as you wanted. Nothing ever happened to it because they were grown properly in those days. You know, most of the country was growing plants in the ground. And they dug them up, wrapped them in burlap, and sent them to your house. California is the only one back in the 50s and 60s that grew in containers because we didn't freeze in the winter. If a plant's in a pot and it's freezing outside, the roots die. So we were the only ones that were doing that, but we were using this soil. But then to make it lighter, they told us to use peat and sand, but that was expensive. So the university said, well, how about if we go peat, bark, and sand, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So that was kind of like the things that nurseries did in the 70s, even into the early 80s, and it wasn't too bad because most of the stuff wasn't decomposing too fast. But when they did more studies in the 80s, and the nurseries at that time, they asked, you know, how do we grow plants in containers the quickest? So in the 80s, what was happening is all the nurseries around the United States were figuring out that they can grow plants in containers if in the winter, instead of putting them in the greenhouse, they made holes in the ground and put them in a hole in the ground. So what they would do is put a slightly larger pot in the ground in a hole and put this one into that pot in the ground, and then they wouldn't have to put them in a greenhouse. The ground around them was insulating the soil. So everybody started growing plants in pots in the 1980s, but they want to know how to grow them faster because you grow them in this. In a pot, it's a little bit slow because, well, it turns out the better the air exchange, the faster plants, the more vigorous roots are, the faster they grow. And you put this in a container and the air exchange isn't great. So the more permeable the soil is, the faster. So what they found out in the 80s, if you fill the pot with this, it only takes you 3 months to grow a plant and get it sold. I mean, the other problem with the nursery industry is it's to become more efficient. They all became separate things. So back in the 50s, the nursery was a local, and my father's nursery was a local garden center. He grew his plants, he sold them directly to the customer, and he heard what happened. In the 80s, they started doing wholesale, huge, 100,000 acre wholesale growers that would just sell them to a garden center and never hear about it. So they wouldn't get any feedback to what was happening to their plants. So for the 3 months it takes to grow a plant, the bark can do this. 8 months later, it's a dead zone. It can't do what it did initially. So what happens? So if you've got a little graph here and you go, okay, we'll put oxygen availability on one side and moisture retention on the other. If you use a soil like this, the moisture retention is pretty decent, and it stays decent forever because it doesn't change. This is permanent stuff. It doesn't change. The oxygen availability doesn't change either because it does the same thing. So that's this soil. if you use bark, initially the oxygen availability is really high because this is much airier than this. So it's really high, but as it decomposes, it does this. The moisture retention initially is quite low because it's very airy, but the young plants that they start in pots are very small. So the moisture retention doesn't have to be there. The moisture retention does this. So in about 8 months, it crosses that line and goes toxic. So if you leave this Matilaha poppy in this composty soil for too long, it's going to die in there. Now, if you surround it with pure sand, if you've got real sandy soil and you surround it with that, it's got a better chance because it's no longer a solid plastic wall. Now it's very airy soil all around it, so it's got a chance. So people who live in sandier neighborhoods like Santa Ana, Anaheim, Garden Grove, they've got a better chance with the plants that have been grown in bark. But if you live in Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa, where the soil is essentially like this, clay, it doesn't breathe at all. You put this in there, it's just like putting it in a container in the ground, it'll rot out. And then the local nursery tell you, oh, you watered it too much. So that's the issues we have, and the industry is not changing. It's primarily because the academia won't change. And it's because they have to follow, instead of following intuition and common sense, they have to follow the research papers. So I was told, by the EPA, who also is kind of academia, that I couldn't put, I'd have to prove that my soil was a permanent potting soil. Like, you can't tell me that, like, our potting soil is mostly quartz. I have to prove that quartz, which is pumice, sand, perlite, is permanent.
So, I live in Orange. And my lot is hard. It's almost concrete. The clay is so hard. But if I dig a hole and put the loamy soil in it, will it still be trapped inside the clay? And will it grow?
The water can get trapped and it'll drain more slowly, but the air can get in. It's not so much about water, it's about oxygen availability to the roots. So yeah, I had a friend, he died a few years ago, but he was a contractor for many years, and he worked down in San Juan Capistrano, which is a lot of clay in that area, especially the hills around there. And he says he didn't have any problem with the plants he was planting because he would surround each one with pure sand. And a lot of the professional contractors do that. So if you see the specs, I was looking at the specs for a hotel. They're planting these, 5-foot box trees, huge box trees, and the specs are you surround them with that much sand. Keeps them from rotting away. The LA airport back in the 80s, when they were redoing that for the Olympics, they said that they were planting huge box trees in the airport, and there was a cement truck with them dumping wet sand around them. That's how they plant them real fast. They just have this cement truck filled with wet sand, and they just poured that around the trees as they planted them. So they knew at that time that rotting was a main issue, and sand would prevent it. So air flowed to the roots. I don't know the soil around LA Airport, but if it's flat ground there, it may be pretty mucky.
Can I ask,
Yes.
what kind of sand is that you're talking about? Is that playground sand? Is it
Any
playground
sand
or
will work.
any sand?
So generally, if you're using sand to plant plants, and the cheapest sand is the best sand, and it's usually either the wash sand. If you buy it in bags, wash sand, all-purpose sand are usually very inexpensive. Place sand is very pricey because they heat sterilize it, steam sterilize it. It still works. So.
And doesn't that eventually, over the years, I also have clay soil. I live in Huntington Beach. Even if you would dig a hole and put the sand in and then the plant, doesn't the sand and the clay, eventually the clay pushes the sand back in? If you add any kind of lighter soil, it eventually goes away. Maybe it blows away.
Well, again, there's nothing really wrong with clay. That's the thing. Back in the 60s, when my parents moved from Pasadena, which had soil that looked like this, to Mission Vale that's had soil that looked like this, he planted all his plants and nothing died. Because in the 60s, we did not grow plants in the wrong soil. We grew them in this soil. So there was nothing wrong. The clay was just fine. In fact, if you go back to the old literature back before 1900, I had a book, someone lent me a book, University of California, Orange County Farming, 1900. All the farmers wanted to be in Fountain Valley, Costa Mesa, where it was clay, because clay was considered the rich soil. This stuff, they couldn't farm in, because back in those days, we had flood irrigation. 2 days after you irrigated this, it was bone dry again. You have to flood it all the time. This stayed wet for weeks. So this was considered the rich soil. This was considered the poor soil. And some literature still mentions that because it's always been that way. This is the poor soil you couldn't grow plants in until we had irrigation. This was the soil we were growing plants in because it stayed wet. But nowadays, this combined with this is a killer. You combine compost with soil that doesn't breathe, and everything just rots away. So that's the problem. And the universities aren't helping that much because they keep telling you, this has got no nutrition. You need to grow your plants in this, in organic matter. And we've also read, the more organic matter you put in the ground, the richer it becomes. Well, the more deadly it becomes. You can grow tomatoes.
Well, that's what caused the confusion is everybody grows these wonderful tomatoes around here, and they think that they're doing the right thing. They don't realize that the tomato, you almost can't even kill it.
Right.
But then your other plants die, and it's like, what did I do wrong from that spot to this spot? And I did do different soil in both spots, but one spot the tomatoes didn't thrive, and the other.
Yeah, so one of the main things to avoid when you first start a garden is don't go down, like I learned about dirt over 30 years ago because I had bought a new house. I had all these raised beds. Needed 170 cubic yards to fill it. So I went down, I thought the soil company knew this stuff. So I went down to the soil company, asked them, what do I fill all these raised beds with? And they told me to get this topsoil that they called it topsoil, even though this is actual topsoil. They said their topsoil was 60% this and 40% compost. So it was really rich. So I filled my beds with it, not knowing what was going to happen. That was the worst thing I could have done. And within 6 months, plants were just rotting and falling over. I'm going, what in the world? I grew plants in my last house, which had soil like this, and I never had any problems. I put some planter mix around the plants and didn't have any problems. But this stuff that's 40, they said was really good. What's wrong? It took me years to figure out. In fact, in the late 80s, when the nursery was changing to soils that had a lot of compost in them, my dad called up the ag department because up until the 1980s, we watered the nursery every day. I mean, I remember him telling me when I was in high school, The nursery industry is really easy. You water every day, you fertilize once a month. But in the 80s, the plants started rotting on us. The plants we were growing and getting from other growers were rotting. So we called in the ag department. They told him, you can't water your plants every day. You'll rot them. It's overwatering. And so after they left, he turned to me and told me, because I had a BA or BS from UC Irvine, you figure this out. Because I've watered our plants every day for the last 35 years, and suddenly it doesn't work. So it took me 10 years to say, okay, this is it. This is the problem. We're growing stuff in compost nowadays, and we didn't used to do that. I also met up with my mentor was a scientist I had met from NASA. He was an independent researcher working for this space program in NASA, and he says, your industry is stupid. And I was listening. I wanted to listen to him because I was having so much frustration with what we were doing at the time, and I couldn't figure out what to do. You water a little bit every day, or wait till it's totally dry and then water it. Couldn't figure out what was right. He says, yeah, there's no organic matter in soil. In the space shuttles, they sent up spun glass. Now soil, we ought to do this. So this soil, perfect soil, is a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Soil is actually broken down granite. So you take a granite rock, the white parts, the lighter parts of granite are pure quartz. The darker parts, and quartz is silicon dioxide, which is the same thing as glass. The darker parts are silica mixed with other minerals in the crystal structure, like iron if it's reddish, magnesium. I'm not sure of all the other minerals that are combined. It makes the dark specks, and those specks become the clay. So sand and silt are the lighter parts of granite. That's pure quartz. If you look at soil in a microscope, it's very interesting. All the little particles look like glass or quartz. They're clear. Yeah. So sand is quartz. So it's and sand has gone through a river. When granite breaks down initially, it becomes decomposed granite. So the quartz and the clay are kind of still there. Once the river gets through with it, then it's the clay is almost separated out. The clay, so the sand and the silt kind of fall out the rivers near the hills. So these hills back here are sandy clay. The soil right below the hills, because they washed out of the riverbed quickly, are sand and silt. So Irvine, a lot of Irvine near the hills, Anaheim, that area is very sandy soil. And then the clay, which is a lot smaller particle. So sand is big particles, so they drop out of the river fast. Silt is like 1/10 the size of sand. And then clay is like 1/100th the size of silt. So clay is microscopic, you can't see it. It floats in the river a long ways until the river slows down right where it enters the ocean. So the clay is Fountain Valley, Los Alamitos, Costa Mesa as the river slows down. But right next to the river, it's still sandy, but where the rivers used to overflow and slow down in the land nearby, that's where the clay settled out. So the clay are these really tiny, flaky particles. Silt and sand are basically round. When you have, I need to bring one thing over here, one second. I must have put it in the closet, so I'll just draw this out. So the way that this soil holds moisture is that soil particles are charged. They have a negative charge, or is it positive? I'm pretty sure it's negative charge on them. So soil particles have a charge. Water molecules are an oxygen and two hydrogens. They're not attached on two sides, they're attached kind of on one side. So this side, this water molecules are ionic. They've got a charge on them. The oxygen is negative and the hydrogens are positive. So water molecules tend to stick to anything that's got a charge on it. So if this has got a negative charge, then the hydrogens just stick to it, at least one molecule thick, really strongly, and a little bit less as you go further away from the particle. Silt, same thing. One layer of water really strongly, and then some molecules out. Clay, being the smallest particle, it's holding a lot of water. So water sticks to all the soil particles. To sand, it sticks the least. So I wish I had my thing over here, but if you have a foot cylinder of sand, it will be able to capture, if you poured water on the top, it'll be able to capture about a ½ inch of water in that foot of sand. If you have a foot of clay, it can capture over 2 inches of water before the water goes out the bottom of that cylinder. So clay can hold up to 5 times as much water as sand can, just because the way the particles are sized and built, they're like flakes. And sand is this big, comparatively big rock, so they can only hold water on the outer surface. Clay can be as thin as 28 molecules thick. I don't know how thick sand is, millions of molecules thick by the time you get to that size. But they say clay can hold quite a bit of water. The problem with clay, if you have pure clay, so permeability of the soil, the ability of soil to breathe is the size of the gaps between the particles. The bigger the gaps, the more airflow, the more easier air can move through the soil. So you can imagine if you got sand particles against sand particles, that soil breathes pretty good. So round particles in geometry, if you have a spherical particle, it takes up 2/3 of the volume, airspace 1/3. So sandy soil is 1/3 airflow, which is a lot of airflow through there. Silt is smaller holes, still 1/3 airflow, but much smaller holes, a little bit harder to breathe through silt. Clay is actually more air than sand, but the holes are also tiny, that it's really hard to get air through clay soil. So a sandy loam, if you have a soil that's called a sandy loam, loam just means the soil does have sand, silt, and clay in it. That's all that loam means. We see a lot of bad information out there saying that make your soil more loamy by adding compost to it. You're just killing your dirt. Loam means there's sand, silt, and clay, all three particles, so it can hold the moisture with the clay, it can breathe with the sand. Sandy loam is like this soil here. This is a lot of sand in that soil. It's like 50% sand. Silt, it might be 40% silt and 10% clay. I think we estimated this was actually about 8% clay. So the soils that breathe, because the space between bigger particles is 33%, once you hit 35% clay in content in your soil, it's clay soil. It no longer breathes. There's no more air spaces between the sand and the silt. So the hills back here are sandy clay, there's a lot of sand in it, but there's too much clay. The clay is blocking up all the pores in the sand. So it's not that much clay. It may only be 40% clay, but it's enough to block the airflow. So let's say sandy clay. You can have 50% sand in it, but if you've got 40% clay and 10% silt, you can't breathe. Now, the geologists know all the soils in Orange County. They buy the makeup of this clay, sand, and silt, and the type of clay and the type of sand that's in there. I mean, there are geology reports throughout Orange County that tell you, oh, this area's got, the sandy clay, this is sand, this is sandy loam. And they name the soils in different areas. So if you've got some of those geology reports, they'll tell you what you have. But again, none of this matters that much. This is just how soil works. If you've got the sandier soils, the plants that are growing in the wrong soil can survive better. And if you got clayish soils, you've got to work on your plants to make them do better. Now, back in the 80s, when we were selling soils at that time that were, I would say 100% compost, because we didn't know any better. And we started doing when we talked to that soil scientist, we go, okay, we got to check this out. So we got identical pots of pure sand. First test plant was strawberry plant. So in this pot, about 12-inch pot, pure sand, and another 10-inch pot, pure. At that time, the potting soil we're selling, which was considered the #1 potting soil on the West Coast, was Whitney Farms' Uncle Malcolm's potting soil. So he put that in that pot, put the strawberry plants, same strawberry plants in both, fertilized them both equally. The plant in the compost soil grew about this big, had strawberries about that big. That's what we're selling. That's what we're used to. The plant in sand was over 2 foot wide with leaves that big, strawberries about 3 times the size. We're going, okay, we cannot sell organic potting soil anymore. It's of negative. If it's worse than sand, what can you say about it? I mean, so we started doing a lot of research, and back in the 1800s, sand was the original potting soil. My dad's bonsai book, sand is the most vigorous potting soil known. So in China and Japan, they've been doing potted plants for thousands of years. They knew what they were doing. For bonsai, they couldn't use sand because the plants grew too vigorous. In bonsai, they want the plants to be totally stunted. So they would add clay to it to make it more stunted. But they never mentioned anything about putting ground up dead trees in their soil mix. And they didn't have peat moss. So they just used sand, sandy sand or clayus. They knew what was going on. But our industry, because they're using apparently tomato plants, I mean, even University of California, I saw one of the first tests back in the 1970s where they're testing the potting soils. And of course, they're using tomatoes to test. And they said, boy, the tomatoes do so well in ground up bark. The more bark this potting soil has, the better it is. That was their test result. That ground up bark was the ideal medium because it grew tomato plants. In fact, in the 1990s, we went to another University of California meeting about potting soils. And the plants, so the college professor there was creating potting soils out of organic things because, organic was the big thing in those days. You had to recycle dead things to be conscientious to the environment. So they're making all their potting soils out of dead things. The test plants they're using they had 4 test plants. I don't remember the last one. One was ferns. One was impatiens. In fact, I can't remember the last 2. But with the potting soils that they had made, and they were comparing them to the major ones that are being sold at that time, The only plant that didn't die in all the in every case was impatiens. So they based the results on the patients, as the ferns all died. I believe it was cyclamens, they all died. We don't, and I was, in those days, I didn't want to challenge professors because I didn't have a PhD, but I would have told them, what kind of test is this if the plants are dying? But the impatiens made it. So they're using the test results from the impatiens, and he was proud because the soil he had made, the plants had done better. He'd made it out of the ground up trunks of palm trees. So that was his test result, but everything else died. So anyway, the mentor I had from NASA, he was growing everything in pure pumice rock, which is the volcanic like sand, and putting air holes through it, big pieces of quartz and putting air holes through it. So he was using that, but he was living on the coast and it was doing just fine with his plants on the coast. Inland, we were in Lake Forest at the time, and pumice just didn't hold enough moisture for an entire day. So I asked you guys at UC Riverside, what holds water the best for plants? And they said peat moss. So clay actually holds water better than peat, but it doesn't let it go. It won't give it to the plants. It'll stay wet. It won't give it to the plants as well as, so peat moss will hold a lot of water, but it'll give it all to the plants and get bone dry. So this is nature's best water holder for plants. This is the most airy material that nature makes for plants. So we thought, well, let's put the two opposites together and see what we get. Well, we got a mix, and we called it our ass mix because it had a lot of peat. It still works really well. Just half peat and half volcanic rock. You get the two opposites together, and peat is good for California because our tap water is alkaline, our soil is alkaline, so the acidity helps too. Everything grows in this. The problem, because we had 50% peat is not quite permanent. Plus, it's so light when it dries. You know, if you're watering with a hose, you blow the peat moss off the top of your container. So you're losing your peat moss either to slow decomposition or to just blowing away. So we noticed plants and ass mix, the volume tend to drop about 15% in 1 year. Yes.
So with your soil there, you're saying that I could grow berries. 'Cause I've been trying for years. I have many friends who've tried to grow blueberries, raspberries. And the plants get about this big and then they just stop. They'll put a half dozen berries for the year and that's it. Can I actually grow blackberries or berries with your soil?
This is what we use. Our acid mix is what we use for all the berries, blueberries. It stays acidic for about 3 years, and then the alkalinity of our tap water, which is really alkaline, it's like pH 10, starts to overcome it. So you've got to then reacidify it by adding sulfur to it, sulfate ammonia, aluminum sulfate. There are things that reacidify the soil, but this is quite good. So one of the first tests we did is we stick a cyclamen. Cyclamen are really rot prone too, into acid mix, set it in a container, set it into a tray of water, just left it sitting there in water. And the plant was good for the 7 years we had the plant. We finally sold it. We go, okay, this is going to go forever. But it was sitting in water whereas cyclamen, you get them from grower and compost, you set them in water, and it rot in a week.
Right.
They rot really fast. But in our acid mix, 7 years nonstop bloom. So we're very happy with that. So acid mix can sit in water, it doesn't seem to cause trouble. But since it does drop down, we're thinking, okay, for a permanent plant in a pot like a tree, like blueberries are okay if you keep adding more acid mix on top because they'll root through their stems. But for a tree like an orange tree or a vine or a bush, we wanted something that didn't shrink on us. So what we did, So our acid mix. Now, for about 5 years back in the 90s, after we created this, it was noted in a local marijuana grower's handbook that the acid mix grew marijuana really well. But acid mix is 50% peat moss and 50% pumice. So pumice rock, when it's ground up like this is 70% air. Lots of air in there. So that's why we use it. And peat moss holds water very well. So we created something different called Top Pot. And our test plant was gardenias. Now, I don't have any gardenias in the store right now, but gardenia is another one that belongs on this side where they just turn yellow and fade away after a year or so. So the way we made this is 35% peat moss. And that's the only thing that can change 35% peat. Is 30% pumice, 20% perlite, which is man-made pumice. That's a little bit lighter than the pumice. You know, there's a lot of different pumices in nature. My mentor got pumice from a volcano in New Mexico for his house. And you can take the pumice and put in your hands and blow and it just floats. It is incredibly lightweight. But this is heavier pumice from volcanic areas in California. But perlite, especially the small perlite, is quite light. There are heavier perlites too. And then it's 10% sand because we wanted some sand in there. Sand is the only remnant of real dirt. And then it's 5% charcoal. So charcoal is interesting. It's organic, but it's inert organic matter. So there's no bacteria and fungus that breaks this stuff down. And the nice thing about charcoal is it's nature's filter. That's why we use charcoal in filters. All the minerals stick to it. Everything sticks to it. This is the reason that black souls of the world are rich. But a lot of horticultural articles say, add compost to your soil until it's rich and black. Well, if you add this to the soil and it turns black on you, that's sewer gases. That's the worst thing you can ever do, is make your soil black from adding compost to it. You just created a landfill, essentially, if you add compost to your soil and it turns dark on you. It doesn't even have to get that bad. When I got that topsoil from the local soil supplier and plants started rotting in there, it had an odor, but it wasn't turning black, except near where the sprinkler valves were. The odor is from acids created by organic decomposition when the oxygen level is low. It wasn't turning black on me except in certain spots. But charcoal is dark, and charcoal is what makes the rich black soils of the world both rich and black. So they say, the way charcoal forms is either really screaming hot wildfire where there's just not enough oxygen to burn the wood, or if you're near a volcano in Italy, you got a lot of black soil around you because the volcanoes keep blowing up there. So when the volcano blows up, carbon dioxide just comes down the size, 500 degree carbon dioxide or 5,000 degree carbon dioxide comes down those slopes and incinerates the trees, but they can't burn because there's no oxygen. Turns all the charcoal. So the rich soils of Italy, charcoal from volcanoes.
Well, the guys that live next door to me, they're always burning wood. They say they're making biochar. So that must be like what you're talking about with the charcoal. They take little sticks of wood and they burn them, but they don't really burn them all the way through.
Right.
And then they're mixing that into the soil.
Right.
With the plants and the trees and everything around. the property.
Yeah, most biochar companies aren't allowed to operate in California because of all the carbon dioxide.
Right, I keep telling them that. I said, you guys are so lucky that nobody's come here. The fire department hasn't showed up. The cops said stay on the other side of the wall, haven't come over here. So,
Of course, there is some benefit to it because not all the charcoal becomes carbon dioxide. It's stored as, once it becomes charcoal, it's no longer going to turn into carbon dioxide. It's going to stay charcoal pretty much forever. So what they do to make charcoal is they take a lot of organic material, set it on fire real hot, and then they eliminate the oxygen. So the way they do it in the third world countries is they'll take all the stuff from a crop and pile it up, set it on fire, and then bulldoze dirt on top of it. So it's super hot, no oxygen. They get a lot of ash, which is no good. But the charcoal then permanently from that point on will make the soil rich and black. So
now I understand what they're doing. So because they do it in a hole in the ground. They dug a hole in the ground and they kind of
yeah,
keep it from really burning.
yeah.
And then they spray it with water.
So charcoal is real expensive to make
Oh.
conventionally. So they have these 20-foot metal boxes, the storage units, and they can change them into things where they fill it with stuff, burn it, and then close the doors. So charcoal we put in there because it can do that. It's also very light. So that's our top pot. We found out if we lower the peat moss to 35%, we don't think it actually contributes much to volume because the spaces around the pumice and the perlite and the sand is 1/3 of the volume and if the peat moss being a lot smaller just fits between those places. So even if the peat moss disappears, it's not affecting the volume very much because it was never contributing to it that much when we have that much big stuff in the rest of that. So we don't seem to lose much volume on plants in our top pot because of that.
Is that where you get your water retention from? Is it peat moss?
Yeah, we need the peat moss, especially because if you have a pot full of this, you pour water in that, the water goes, it doesn't go anywhere but straight down. The peat moss is very good at wicking it sideways. So that's the other reason we need peat in here, is to wick it sideways. Now, we're thinking of, if the tariffs cause peat moss to get too pricey, we're thinking of putting vermiculite. So vermiculite is popped clay. We know you can't put too much, and you put 30% of this in a potting soil mix, it's just gooey. It doesn't work. So we figure, okay, let's substitute maybe 10% of the peat moss with 10% vermiculite, or maybe just hold that at 5% vermiculite to hold more water and wick the water around without using the peat. So now what's interesting, so that's our soil, and it's becoming pretty famous. I got an email yesterday from someone from Connecticut saying, how do I get your top pot? Our distributor is BFG, is the company that distributes, and they bought up most of the smaller lawn and garden supply distributors throughout the United States. So they're nationwide now, but they make our stuff because pumice is more available in California than it is on the East Coast. They make this stuff in Sacramento, and so far the furthest east they've shipped it is to Idaho. I've had people tell me they've gotten bags of it on the East Coast through Amazon, so someone on the West Coast buys it from BFG and ships it at high expense to the East Coast. Most of the cost of it is shipping, because this stuff weighs, our top pot here weighs, it can weigh 40 pounds plus, depending on how much rain is falling on the materials outside in Sacramento. So we know this is mixed with tractors. Most of the potting soils are mixed in blending machines, But one of the problems we have is that the materials we use, pumice, sand, perlite, they chew up the blending machines. So they don't want to put this stuff through their regular blend. They'd rather put organic matter through their blending machines, not chunks of pumice rock. So they do that. We know they do this with tractors because sometimes we'll get big pieces of sand that haven't been broken down well, just big chunks like this in bags. Sometimes big pieces of charcoal that they didn't break down. So I mean, sometimes their customers complain, not too much. I had a rag that was this big in one of these bags once, so we know that they're not putting it through their blending machines. They're just mixing it out on a big pad. So they're trying to do it that way. So anyway, that's our soil, and it's sold in around 20 nurseries and garden centers throughout California. We can't make the garden center buy it. I mean, I've heard of one place that actually carried it because we told them it was good stuff. Overpass Nursery in Santa Barbara area, we got them to carry it, and a lot of our customers are up there that see our videos are happy about that. But usually it's the customers going to the nursery saying, we want this stuff, and they finally reluctantly, it's always reluctantly, they tell us we don't, they reluctantly get it, and then they keep selling and keep selling because it keeps working better than anything else they have. So
I've been going to Home Depot and I keep looking for soil, and it's like, where's the damn dirt? Where's the soil?
yeah,
This is not soil.
yeah.
I open up the bag and I look at it and go, this is not soil.
Can't even get
So I
sand.
can't wait to try your stuff.
But soil, sand does work.
Yeah.
Again, sand, when we did all our tests when we did lots of vegetables, we did trees, pure sand. In fact, I've got a tree out here that we put in a 24-inch pot of sand in 1997. It still looks really good, just in straight sand. So we know sand is ideal, but it's just so heavy to move. You need a good strong dolly to move it. So most of our customers have learned how to fix plants. Most of our longtime customers over the years, because we've shown them how to fix plants. I'll just point out real fast how to do this. Now, the most gentle way to remove soil from plants. Oh, well, the other thing I would say is that if you buy plants with only this much compost around them, it usually won't kill them. It will kill a lavender, because we were buying lavenders with this much, say, bark around them and putting them into our top pot, and they were still rotting away. So we know that lavender is extremely sensitive, but most, like these blueberries, which are in bark, when it's only 4 inches across, there's enough oxygen getting to the middle of that it stays alive. There's only 2 inches of compost between the air on the outside and the roots in the middle. So it's probably not going to be too much. Once you get to 6 inches wide, like in these 1 gallon buckets, that's getting a little wide. I would take a hose and blast it to get it down to about this big. So what we found out on plants is that you can cut half the roots off of just about any plant without killing it. And you can take off half the soil on any plant without killing it. Sometimes we like to, usually we like to take all of it off, but we did a lot of blueberries, take it off, not take it off. If it's only this much, we didn't see any difference at all. Even with this much, it wasn't too bad. But on some plants, it's really nasty. Now, a lot of growers use pots that are real skinny for that main reason, because if this was in a wider pot, this bark in here might cause more damage to this plant, but because it's so skinny, that you surround this with good soil, it's not going to cause much trouble at all. We don't bother to take the soil off of these, even though it's mostly bark. And this being really skinny, not a problem at all. In fact, this company actually knows what they're doing. This is perlite and peat moss only, which we consider just fine. But here's a plant that fuchsias tend to rot real easy. Now, so before we had all these droughts come along, back in the 90s, and we had a larger piece of property. We had 3 acres. I would just sit at the high end of our property and take the hose and get one of those valves on the end of it where you can turn it down almost to zero. So it'd just be a real sharp jet stream of water, and just sit there and wash this stuff off. So I had a little river running through our nursery, but we had enough dirt it just soaked in. But now that we're in more of a perpetual drought situation, then we try to take a lot of it off without using the water. A lot of times I'll get a lot of it off and I go, okay, these last bit of roots, they look real delicate to me, so I'll just lay it on the sidewalk and then hose the last bits of it off. So whenever we change the soil on plants, we also like to, if the plant's got a lot of new growth on it, we like to eliminate a lot of the new growth so it doesn't go into shock. So new growth uses a lot of water, the old growth doesn't. And every time you work with the roots, you're compromising those roots for the next 2 weeks. It takes roots about 2 weeks to recover from anything you're doing to them, washing the dirt off or picking the dirt off. So I like to make the plants smaller by cutting off, especially the new stuff. If I'm real careful, I don't have to cut anything off. Like one of the easiest plants we found, probably the easiest plant we found to remove soil from not damaging the plant much, is citrus. We had a class a couple weeks ago on citrus, but we used to do, when we were selling citrus here 8 years ago, we would just take the ones in the 5-gallon buckets, take it out of the bucket, drop it on the asphalt, drop, turn, drop, turn, drop, turn, drop, turn, and it would just make the root ball soften up. Grab the trunk and tap the trunk with the other hand, and all the dirt would fall off. And the roots, we might lose maybe 10 to 15% of the roots. That's about it. It would hold together. In fact, it would hold the shape of the pot. So we just stick it back in the pot, pour the top pot around it, put some fertilizer back in around it, watered it, put it in half a day of shade for 2 weeks. It was great, and we sold them. And from that point on, you can water that citrus as much as you wanted. You could leave it in a tray of water. It would no longer turn yellow on you when you watered frequently.
I needed to know this a month ago. I bought 40 citruses. They're all planted.
So the way you can get it, well, it doesn't work too well. So back in the 80s, before I knew all this stuff, I knew that on citrus, if I didn't water the root ball itself, I watered right outside of it with the drip system, my plants did okay. They would actually not turn yellow from the dripper being on every day, and they would slowly grow and get going. Later we learned if you take it all off, they'll grow 2 or 3 foot a year. They grow really fast when there's no compost around them. Back in around 20 years ago was the last time I put a citrus in the ground in my yard in good soil without removing the compost. I wanted to see how well it did. So it sat there and didn't turn yellow because I was watering with the drip, but didn't grow for 10 years. It just sat there and just stood still. And finally, when it was about 10 years in the ground, it just started taking off. And we figured, okay, the compost is finally slowing down decomposition now, so the roots are finally getting going. And it finally started blooming and growing after 10 years of sitting there. Now my previous experience, I wasn't real aware of what was things were going on. But I remember back in the 60s, some of the nurseries, like the citrus growers, are already planting stuff in compost back even in the late 60s. And my parents put citrus in the ground in their yard in the clay soil Mission Viejo. And they would sit there and look ugly for the first 5 years. But they wouldn't die, and they would slowly regroup, and by 8th or 9th year, they were looking pretty good. And so I grew up thinking citrus were real slow to get going. In the 1980s, I bought my own home, and I went to a citrus orchard supplier, and they grew their trees in sand. I put that in the ground in my house, and it grew 3 feet that year and had a crop. I'm going, this is not like the citrus we sell to our customers. So for the next 10 years, I bought citrus for my customers from the orchard suppliers, not from the retail companies, but from the orchard suppliers. So we did that for a long time until they started having all these problems with HLB. And then the growers up north that were getting those orchard trees from didn't want the paperwork going to the HLB area. So that's when we started taking the grower soils from here and then just taking it off and putting our own on it. We did that for a while until we got into the quarantine zone. And now we can't do it anymore. Or we can't handle citrus anymore. We can still buy citrus for our own use at our houses and do it. So this plant, the roots are very delicate, so they're breaking off. I'll probably lose about half the roots on this plant doing this. So this plant would be better if I had done it with water. But still, we don't usually lose fuchsias. They're pretty, even though we're losing a lot of their roots, they're pretty resilient. I haven't really killed a fuchsia doing this. Now, some plants, this doesn't work. If you mess with the roots, you're going to lose them. I would tell you avocados are one of those plants. When you damage avocado roots by fooling with the dirt, you might induce a disease on them that slowly kills them. So when we do avocados, we lose over half eventually, not right away. We want to watch and see if they start growing. A lot of times they grow real fast. Okay, we'll sell this one. A lot of times they'll sit there for a year and then slowly wither away. We figure, okay, that one got a root infection somehow. So we're not going to sell it. So we don't try to fix avocados from other growers. Although a lot of our customers, if they buy from other growers and figure stuff out, they try and they'll be successful part of the time. But not good enough for us. So we buy these trees that are not in bad soil and grow them ourselves. And gardenias, we were losing over half. So we no longer try to fix gardenias. But again, better than nothing. If you've got gardenias that are dying, you might try to want to fix them. Now you can do this while they're in the ground already. So once we were planting gardenias in my house, and my wife planted them before I fixed them. And I knew they were going to die because that's what they were doing. So what I did I did 3 out of the 5 that she had planted. I had time. I went in there with a hand trowel and just dug away about that much of the soil and try not to break too much roots off, and replaced it with our top pot. And 2 of the 3 I did survive. The other 2 I didn't get to died. So they're not perfect, but that's one way to do it once they're in the ground without doing too much damage.
But if they're in a pot, I repotted mine twice and it's just getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, we'll try to save it. Just pull it out of the pot and remove the soil. Yeah, and then put it in, half a day of sun. I mean, you can't. We've done it where we put them in total shade, but they don't get any energy that way, and then they just die anyway. So you've got to have them in some sun, but not full day sun, because they don't have enough roots to handle especially the heat of the day. Although we've put them between houses before, and they were fine. Yeah. So if they get dappled light, that's pretty good.
Now, would that method work if I wanted to? The new citruses I put in the ground, it was from a grower in Fillmore, and they seemed really sandy when I pulled them out. But I did the typical dig a big hole and put the
Compost in there.
composty soil around it,
Well, just take that off.
trying to clean some of that off.
Yeah. Now citrus are interesting because they're one of the few plants that doesn't mind having their roots exposed to sunlight.
Oh, okay.
So if you just want to blast away some of the soil around the trunks of those, like if you go to Florida, because it rains so much there, you drive through a citrus orchard in Florida, the trees look like this. They plant them really high, about 8 inches up, and then the rains and stuff just wash the soil off that area. I don't know if the trees they're buying are in compost. I don't know. I haven't been to Florida too often, but I've driven through there and seen the trees looking like that. Any other plant would just burn up. The roots would just burn, but citrus, they don't mind that. Interesting.
So I have 2 lemon trees that were planted by the former tenant. I thought that it didn't grow because he kind of planted them like in the middle of summer. They'll get sunlight. During the winter, because of the shadow from the house, they get half sunlight or less. And I thought that that's why they weren't really thriving. They've been in the ground about 6 years and they've produced about a half dozen lemons. And so,
Yeah, it's the soil that's causing the trouble because lemons will grow in shade.
oh, they are.
They can grow in shade. I mean, I planted lemons on the north side of my house just to see what happens, and they made lemons.
Wow.
They did okay.
So I could dig down around the base of one of the 2 trees and remove a lot of the clay and a lot of the soil.
Yeah, when you're working with a hand trowel, try not to cut because there'll be a lot of roots going on across the surface because they can breathe. Just try to avoid those and go underneath those and try to get this area near the base of the trunk cleared out. And you don't even have to put the dirt back. You just clear it out. They can get air down there. That'll help them out a lot. Or if you want, you can backfill with sand or with our top potting soil.
Could I mix the 2, sand and the top pot?
Yeah, you don't need to. Sand by itself is perfect. I mean, we want you to buy our soil, but you don't have to use it for that purpose because in the ground, weight's not a big deal.
I want to show the guys that are in the front. They're both permaculture educated guys, but they're really trying to do the things on their own. But nobody's been able to get fairies to grow at the house, and I'd love to shop them and grow some fairies. So I want to use your top pot and get to buy some blackberries. They're gonna go, what are you doing? These things won't grow here. They've been trying for 10 years. You just live in a pot and do nothing.
So dropping the root on the ground is, it's fairly smooth, so it doesn't really cut off the roots that badly.
Wow, all that's come off that little one.
Well, it's pretty much, so this mix here is about 10 to 12% perlite. A lot of wood shavings. I don't know if they have any peat. There might be peat in here too. So this is not the worst mix in the world. This appears to be one of the lower price Pro mixes. Pro mix for decades was a standard where they just had peat moss and perlite. And then for nurseries that needed something cheaper, they added a little bit of wood shavings or bark to it, which is not good enough for fuchsias. Fuchsias just don't like that at all.
Now, with the mix that drains properly your top pot, what are the fertilizing needs generally?
Well, so at the nursery, we use this. So when I was growing up, again, my dad said, you need to water your plants every day and fertilize once a month. That's a lot of work in a nursery to go and fertilize every single plant every month. But with most fertilizers, that's what you have to do. So we happen to use Osmocote, which is a time-release chemical fertilizer, and it's one of the best, most complete chemical fertilizers. So organic fertilizers in general are the best fertilizers. Not all, but most of them are ground up dead plants or dead animals.
Would you put those on rose bushes also?
We use this on everything at the nursery. So, well, not quite everything. There's a few plants we don't use it on, but so organic fertilizers generally are the best, but you have to, again, do it every month. So when I was growing up, my dad had a 100-pound bag of blood meal, 100-pound bag of cottonseed meal, 100-pound bag of bone meal. And his employee fertilize the nursery every month. Once, and that was his 1 acre nursery. Once we had a 3 acre nursery, we did that a few times and go, this is too much work. And Osmocote came out, and this one's got, so plants need 13 minerals to be applied to them. 4 in water and in air, so you don't have to apply those, but 13 have to be applied. The soil has a couple minerals. This has got 11 minerals in it. We don't know of any other chemical fertilizer that has that many. A lot of them have 8. A lot of them have the most important 5. So we like this one a lot because they're not missing much. And in our top pot, that may contain a few of the other minerals that they need. So we're pretty happy with this product. But on a lot of plants, I will also put on organic fertilizers at the same time. But this will hold them over for usually until we get the plant sold. And this leaches less than organic fertilizers into the environment. So the EPA actually ran a test on nurseries using Osmocote because they had considered nurseries to be prime polluters of lakes and streams. And they checked a nursery that was using Osmocote and said, boy, they're only losing about, less than 10% of the fertilizers we're making it out of the pot, and less than that we're making it to the local river. So they were quite impressed with this product, that it wasn't leaching like most fertilizers leach out. So that's another reason we use it, because, well, I don't know, we don't really leach to the street unless it's raining. So it stays on the property anyway, but so usually most plants that are propagated for nursery trade, there's a section in the middle. This whole middle here may just be peat and perlite, because the guys who propagate know better. If they put bark in it, it rots their cuttings. So the center of this should be fine. And we'll just put this back in the pot. Now for a lot of potting, we like to use these mortar trays from the big box stores. They're not too expensive. Because, if you just put your hand in a bag of potting soil, you get all dirty. So we've used buckets, but this way we can hold both this is wide enough that we can have more place to work. So our top pot. So we made our top pot, our test plant for growing, to make sure the top pot was as good as we can make it, was gardenia. So we started a gardenia cutting in our top pot and grew it in there for 3 years in a pot not much bigger than this. In 3 years, it was this big and this wide. It looked gorgeous. Not a single yellow leaf. We said, okay, that's good soil, because gardenia was such a problem. So it's meant for gardenias, but we use it for pretty much everything. Cactus, plumerias, ferns. I mean, we'll grow anything in it. If it's good soil, it's just good soil. Just like sand is good soil. So
I also just planted a cherimoya that was really heavy. It was in a small tube, And so I think it had a lot of sand in it, but then I put that same, it's in a pot, and I put that same mulchy.
Yeah, try to get out of there. Cherimois are they're not too sensitive, but they're a bit sensitive. Now, what I do at the nursery is I always put the date I do this so I know how long this, because we don't want to sell it right away. We need the roots to regroup. 2 weeks they'll become functional, but it takes a good month in this size to hold the dirt so when the customer pulls it out, it'll come with the plant, not fall off. So put that in there and try to make sure on some plants and you get the roots that hang straight down. So I'll put a little cone of soil at the bottom and try to spread the roots over the cone so they're not all in one little spot. Kind of spread them out a little bit. And then shake it real good. In the ground, you can't shake the ground, but you can shake a little pot to distribute the soil around the roots a little better. And then throw a little fertilizer on it and then water it within a few minutes so that the roots don't start drying up, because this soil is not bone dry, so it's not too bad. But it's nice to get it watered fairly fast. And usually within about 2 weeks, the plant starts to grow again and it comes out better. I mean, when you have plants that don't look good, like this plant doesn't look that green. If you get that out of there and put it into our acid mix, within a week, it's really green. We don't know why the growers use, well, they use bark because that's what they're told to do. Universities all promote ground up bark as the best growing medium, so they do it. But you can see the colors we're getting when we get these plants, and they're not as green as they could be.
Now, would you recommend the top pot for most things, but then like acid, what about for like citrus? Would you do top pot rather than the acid?
Oh, they're both acidic.
Okay.
We don't know the acidity on top pot, but because peat moss is acidic, it's going to be acidic.
Okay, so that's
Yeah, we're estimating maybe 6 to 6.5. The acid mix might be in the high 5s. It's not as acid as it could be. Some plants like blueberries love it around 4, so you can always add a little more sulfur or sulfate ammonia or something to make it more acid than that. But we've grown blueberries in top pot and they come out just fine. I mean, a lot of plants, the pH is not an issue. Especially if you're fertilizing them organically, because see, chemical fertilizers like this, they're soluble at certain pHs. But organics, when you got the mycorrhizal fungus doing the organic stuff, it doesn't care what the pH is. It still breaks the fertilizer down and gives it to the plant. So if you're fertilizing organically, the pH is not that big a deal. If you're using chemical fertilizers, it's everything.
okay.
So
Do you work that into the soil or just sprinkle it
This?
on and water it?
well, at the nursery, we put it on top because if we bury it, we often forget that we did it. And then the water will kind of mix it into the soil because it's got to be in good.
But like at home, like
Yeah, just
my
mix it into the
roses,
dirt.
I've been just putting it around. I haven't been.
It's better if it's in good contact. So if it's buried slightly, it works better.
I just haven't done it because I can't.
All right. Any other questions today?
One question, you did mention that you will do,
Let me get that.
you mentioned that you, along with the osmocote, it's okay to do like a liquid organic fertilizer also?
We use dry fertilizer.
Oh, okay.
Liquids are a pain for us. Plus, they don't usually last long because they're already soluble, so they just float right through,
Okay.
or they flow right through the pot. So, okay,
Thank you.
we have a follow-up lecture, but that might be not for several weeks, where we talk about fertilizing,
Okay.
mulching, and everything else that's not just the soil.
Cool.
So the soil is most important, but everything else, there's other rules too that we follow.
Thank
All right,
you.
thank you.